What's up, everybody? Brothers, sisters, psychonauts, and seekers of truth. It is Ananka, and welcome to my bazaar. Today, I have a 2C-E trip report for you. The title of this trip report is An Experience of Double Proportions, and was submitted to Erowid in 2008 by the user Aode Musing. With all that being said, let our story begin. It is difficult to describe a drug experience like this one in words. So much of what happened was quite literally indescribable. Feelings with no words, pictures and emotions with no real description available in any language. A friend recently used the metaphor of wishing he could download his experiences into my head so I could just understand it all, rather than having to simply and inadequately only know it in a narrative capacity. This would be the ideal way to describe the night I took 2C-E. But for the sake of preserving the memory, I will attempt to use words, however inadequate, to share the encounter with this incredible chemical. The research Dee and I did on others' experiences with this drug was not as thorough as we would have liked. Many more accounts exist of 2CB trips. They describe the experience as a spiritually focused melding of euphoric ecstasy-like feelings and LSD-like visuals and abstract thinking. Inexperienced in LSD trips as I am, I can say that, yes, there was a similar euphoric feeling like MDMA. However, not nearly as positive or lighthearted. More like a forced state of euphoria. And, as the remainder of this narrative will reveal, the spiritual aspects certainly overpowered the euphoric aspects. Perhaps this is the difference between the B and E elements. About 45 minutes after the first pill, maybe 15 to 20 minutes after the second, I noticed that the couch was breathing. The wrinkles in the leather were writhing, growing and shrinking as if alive, inhaling and exhaling. The entire couch was itself imploding and exploding, as if being sucked partially into a vortex before being pushed out again to normal shape and size. The artwork above the couch was also beginning to move. Different parts of it would spin, swirl, or wriggle. The art is a black and white, symmetrical, semi-pattern oriented piece, and the visuals I was having were also symmetrical, but highlighted the slight imperfections in the symmetry. I was highly aware of the parts of the piece that were slightly different from each other, and they took on great significance. The next clear memory I have is of lying on the couch as Kenny walked in, flooding the whole room with the most intense purple light I had ever seen. He is usually purple to me, but I had a heightened sense of his color. Dee had been getting brighter, and his colors had begun to change since I first noticed the couch. But I had not focused on them until that point, and I realized that he was also purple, but mainly his green core was deeper, brighter and sort of pulsing, which I had never seen happen before. At some point, I remember thinking about how crowded the room was, and how everyone that I had noticed was talking very softly to Kenny, focusing on him and enjoying his light. I told Dee that there were some people in the room, and both he and Kay laughed and said cool. I understood somehow that they were Kenny's people, and when I explained that to Kenny, I think he asked what they were doing. I told him, they love you. I don't know how or why I said that. What they were actually doing was murmuring and sort of moving back and forth. But when asked, I knew to say, they love you. Anything else felt like an incomplete statement. Dee asked if he had any people, and I had not noticed until that moment the woman over his shoulder. I do not know how I knew she was female, because I can't say I actually physically saw a body or a face. Even Kenny's people I could not see with my physical eyes. It was more like I just knew that they were there, almost visible in my physical peripheral vision, but plain as day in my other sight. Dee's woman was much the same, except she did not have any colors to speak of. Just a location and an emotion. A raw, almost primitive, very uncomplicated emotion. She was sad. My heart was instantly heavy, and I felt as though I could cry the moment Dee's question brought her into focus for me. Focusing on her made her aware of me suddenly. It actually made all the people in the room aware of me. I noticed that Kenny's people were a bit more agitated and seemed to draw close around him, while she remained firmly rooted with Dee, but interested in me. I recall touching her face, wanting to help her hurting stop, and this action was formed in response to some sort of question. I think it was something like giving her permission to join me, as I had offered my open help, because upon touching her face, I was flooded with her sadness and repulsed by the sensation of fullness and dissonance that I felt traveling from the pit of my stomach, or even lower, more like my uterus or something slightly behind it, outward in one huge wave. I don't think she quite took control of me that time, but I am sure she was aware of the new sensations of a physical body that she was sharing with me. I lost track of time at some point. I recall getting naked in sexual play. I was highly interested in the texture of skin, the patterns of hair growth, the taste and smell of him. I remember lying on Dee's bed while he licked my skin all over in places that are often neglected or ignored, like down my side across my ribs, my arms, especially on my shoulder and upper arm. He spent so much time and energy there that I found myself losing track of the rest of my body. It was this sensation that made me more aware of Kay's people again. Walls were not actually an issue with them, so even though we were in another room, they remained near. One of them, a man. Again, I haven't a clue how I knew he was a he, but I did. He was loving me with his light, and somehow enhancing the pleasure Dee gave me by this. He seemed to ask me to come, meaning somewhere else, and I did. I didn't realize that I would actually be elsewhere, and thereby deserting Dee in the middle of our lovemaking. I was just so soft and suggestible that I would have done anything that was asked or told. He took me somewhere that I can only describe as green with water. I had a sense that I had been there before. My lucid, sober mind is now trying to convince me it was the pond in the pasture next door to my childhood farm, where I spent so many peaceful hours. But I know it was not, because during the actual trip, I ran all the places I knew it resembled through my head, and that pond upon consideration was discarded. While I was there, I was, in essence, resting. I was awake there, but my body was experiencing what felt like sleep. The next thing I knew, Dee was smiling at me and talking about how much I came. I could tell in my body that I had had a physical orgasm, but I could not remember it or recall getting there. And I realized that he was still with me, very connected to both Dee and I, and he was laughing with joy. By focusing on him, I realized that he had just experienced my orgasm for me, and it seemed as though he was laughing because Dee could not tell the difference between us, and perhaps because he was euphoric with the sensation of sexual pleasure. His laughter, I found, was coming out of my mouth, and I was able to easily maneuver back and forth between his laugh and my throat, and my voice telling Dee what I was laughing about. Dee was a bit upset that I didn't remember the orgasm, and that he had gone down on a man, so to speak, but I was euphoric with his pleasure, and perhaps a bit insensitive to Dee's confusion. After some love play with Dee as the focus, I remember Dee telling me to get dressed so that we could go out into the living room. I vaguely recall dressing myself, despite his offer to help. I have no memory of her presence during the time I was in and out with him, but at some point, I knew her emotions again, and I don't recall what forced my attention away from her. But I remember trying to focus on the map, on D and K, on the couches, on anything but the glaring person in my personal space. For by this time, she did not move with D's movements. She stayed near me. I was not afraid, just slightly annoyed with her persistent negative feelings, and I forcibly filled my own thoughts with the pleasurable things I was experiencing to keep myself away from her feelings. I remember very little about the first few times she came in and I went out. I don't remember Dee's reaction to her, except one incident of him telling me I was channeling someone. My whole being rejected this idea because of the current connotation I hold of that term. It felt inherently wrong, and I shook my head at him. I recall a combined rush of positive energy, and a lifting sensation mingled with a feeling of strength and empowerment at some point upon every return. This made the return a pleasure, and so I welcomed the departures at first, knowing that the return trip would bring another wave of the good stuff. On one trip, however, I found that when I was ready to come back for the good stuff, I could not. I was suddenly terribly aware of the place I was in. A dark, empty void with stifling walls accompanied by an oppressive feeling. I wondered how I had not noticed how scary the place was until that point. But I began searching for a door or a window, so to speak. At least that was how it was manifesting in my mind's eye. Every place I touched, I felt a gentle but persistent pressure of resistance that I liked less and less. I did not begin to panic right away, but eventually I got a bit frantic, and the rapid change in heartbeat was so noticeable that focusing on it suddenly opened a hole that I was able to slip through. I found myself gasping for air, as though I had not been breathing, and shaking violently as though I had been in a physical fight. I was vividly aware of the fact that I had somehow escaped something, but unsure of what that was or what it meant. One trip had me searching the black void, not for holes, but for texture. I think I decided to learn more about my prison in an effort to more easily escape it upon return. For at this point, I was getting familiar with the returning cycle of in and out. On that trip, I recall putting my hand, sort of, in a cold, ugly place that made me understand intuitively that she was pure untruth, meaning her very existence was not even honest, and everything that she felt and thought was a lie. I could tell she was digging in Dee's head for something, and that focus on him brought me face to face with her. It was almost as though my awareness of her actions startled her, and she instantly began to say things to me that were ugly and terrible. I could not coherently register the actual words, more like pictures of emotions. I knew she intended Dee pain and harm, and that I was a tool she wanted to use in that pursuit. This knowledge made me so instantly angry that I found myself shotgunned to Dee like lightning, and that brought me back from the dark place and into my body. I think the above interchange actually took place over a series of several trips away. But after one return, I realized it was getting harder for me to remain present in my body, and harder for me to come back after I was gone. I also recall feeling at one point that maybe she had managed to form words, and I tried to assess whether or not my mouth had been speaking. I asked Dee if she had said anything, and he assured me she hadn't said anything with my mouth, but was trying to communicate with him through expressions and maybe telepathy. I told him she was full of terrible things and lies, and to not believe anything she said. When he asked me what kinds of things she was saying, I knew instinctively that forming her picture thoughts into words would give her another tool, almost like teaching her how to bend my body to her will and make the words. So I did not tell him. I just repeated over and over that they were awful. Unfortunately, my mind was forming the words anyhow automatically, kind of like trying to not think of a pink elephant. That was a terrible mistake, because sure enough, a few more trips in and out, and she was apparently telling Dee all kinds of lies and ugly untruths designed to hurt him most. By this time, Dee was getting frantic and worried. I can only imagine how strange and terrifying it is to watch a loved one shift with such rapid completeness. Add to that the hate-filled things my mouth was telling him on her behalf, and various physical things my body was doing, and he was losing his handle on the good part of his trip pretty fast. She was trying to hurt Dee with words, but at some point, she realized that hurting my physical body would hurt him far more than any words. So she tried to burn me with a lighter, and perhaps other things, I'm not sure. For most of the night, I was oblivious to the darker parts of my trip. I knew I was fighting more and more to stay with Dee in the current plane, but when I was here, the trip was so much fun. The visuals were amazing. The energy in my body was overwhelming. The great sense of love I felt for Dee was intoxicating. I was having a great trip, I thought. But Dee was getting scared and frustrated, and he asked me to please not go away and leave him with her. I remember smiling and promising not to go, but no sooner had I decided I was done visiting that dark place than she had me there against my will. That was the first real moment of fear. Not only was it more difficult than ever to come back, she was now taking me whether I wanted to go or not. This was terrifying. She came more and more frequently, and I was pushed out of my own consciousness over and over. Each trip was taxing on my physical body. My leg would sort of jump, and my feet would sort of twist on the bed or floor or couch in an involuntary response to my intense concentration on trying to stay with Dee. I found I could stay with him longer if I was completely focused on him, but the drug made concentration almost impossible. So while my conscious mind was trying desperately to focus, The chemicals refused to allow me access to that part of my brain for very long. Eventually panic set in, and Dee and I tried to sleep. I would drift off as myself quite easily. It was probably 5 a.m. by that time, and we were tired. But as soon as my conscious mind drifted, she was able to take hold and my body no longer acted tired. I was instantly up and prowling like a caged beast. Poor Dee was unable to get any sleep thanks to this, and his fear of leaving me alone with her. And maybe of his being vulnerable to her while he slept. I was a mess of emotion each time I managed to come back. But each time she came back, the emotions were gone, and I was utterly someone else. I began to find that focusing on Dee's purple colors helped me hold on much longer. But as he hit his come down, his purple fades into his usual greens, and green was not what I needed. I began to ask for Kenny. I knew instinctively that his purples would help me stay present. When he finally came home the next morning, I was still tripping and still fighting her. Dee was exhausted and feeling defeated, and I was beginning to think I would have to give her my body forever. Kenny walked in, and his light was instantly brighter when he came towards me. She was instantly weaker, and although my body was still fighting the trip with the jumpy leg and twisty feet bit, I was able to focus on his words and colors, and hold on for a long time. I think she only had me for a few seconds at a time in Kenny's presence. I recall going to the bathroom to pee, and glancing at my reflection briefly as I started to leave the room. My eyes seemed to flash with some odd, unfamiliar color, and I did a double take. I have brown eyes, but the eyes I caught in the mirror were light, maybe blue, maybe even gray or white. But when I looked again, of course they were brown again. I was, however, mesmerized by the haunted look on my face, and the eyes that were staring back at me from my own skull. Yes, they were the right color, but they were wholly unfamiliar. There was a hardness in them, an angry, vengeful, sharp quality that I have never before seen in my own face. I looked at myself for a very long time, and found my reflection was smirking at me with a triumphant attitude. I thought, why in the hell am I smiling when I am so afraid and weirded out by my own reflection? The answer was, I was not smiling. I touched my face, and the shape of my mouth was not the smile shape on the face in the mirror. This startled me, and I burst out of the bathroom and ran into the boys' company. They asked me if everything was okay, and not wanting to relive the experience, I said yes and pushed it out of my mind. It was surely the drug. That's all. I was eventually able to feel a sort of control over her at some point in my come down. The drug was an avenue of ease for her, and the less of it in my system, the less control she had. I still saw her behind my eyes when I looked in the mirror. That continued for days after, and actually every once in a while I see her to this day, smirking at me, waiting to be let out again. The days and weeks immediately after the trip, I had nothing but blank areas in my memory where she had taken hold. But I have thought of that night frequently ever since, and I have been able to piece together more and more fragments, some from what Dee told me, some from flashes of recollection that would wash over me when something reminded me of a particular event or moment. I did a great deal of soul-searching for a while, trying to decide what she was. I am not sure I believe in possession, but I know I did not enjoy the orgasm I had while he was with me personally, and I know I saw, or at least sensed, every one of the people I seemed to see while tripping. It was as though a veil was lifted from my eyes, while my body and brain were released from their usual prison of low-level consciousness. So perhaps, if you allow it, possession is possible. And maybe that was what I did with the man that had sex with Dee. For a while I thought that was what I did with her as well, unwittingly invited her to enjoy a ride. But deep reflection and coming to grips with some unpleasant truths about myself, coupled with the recent rereading of the first part of this account, has led me to another conclusion. The other people in the room, both living humans on this plane, and the others all had colors that were discernible. The man that had sex with Dee, for instance, was a rosy melon color, but she was colorless. The fact that I mistook her for Dee's person had to do with her location in relation to him. All of Kenny's people were mostly focused on him, and even oriented toward him. She was focused on Dee, but from behind, oriented in such a way that when I focused upon her, and her own focus shifted to me, it required nothing more than a shift of the eyes. The fact that I wanted to help her, and that I so instantly identified with her, even in her deeply bleak and negative state of being, suggests that I felt obliged to do so. And the fact that she is still with me on occasion to this day is the final piece of the puzzle to her identity. She was not a malicious spirit or poltergeist. She was me, or at least the reverse side of me. She was the darker, uglier side of my nature, the part of me I have intentionally ignored, malnourished, stamped out, and tried to kill. This is what we do as good people when faced with our brutish and primal natures. We are civilized, so we refuse those darker impulses and usually ignore them, hating that part of ourselves. She was merely a release of 27 years of pent-up anger, frustration, hate, fear, self-loathing, and a myriad of other negative emotions that are disallowed by a human who has a soul with which to love. Her resentment toward Dee was probably more related to the fact that he fills me with light and love, which is the primary way I keep those ugly aspects of my personality in check. All things considered, the experience was exhilarating, terrifying, and an excellent lesson in self. I know something about myself now that I did not formerly understand, and for that, I would do it again. But this time, I will recognize her if she shows up, and insist that she leaves long before she has any opportunity to control me. All right, everybody. That is the end of our story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Share with us your 2CE experiences down in the comments below. Check out the other videos and playlists on my channel, and I will see you in the next one, fam. Deuces.